Good morning. 2 Kings chapters 4 to 7, day 2. Many years ago, I was invited to preach at a conference which was being put on by a church for all of the business people in the church. And this conference was hosted over the course of a weekend. On the Friday night, the senior pastor of this church preached a message, and then I was due to speak on the Saturday morning. I attended the Friday night session, and to my utter dismay, this pastor proceeded to preach one of the most blasphemous, prosperity gospel, disgusting, filthy, lucre, money-loving, manipulative sermons I have ever had the miserable experience of listening to. That explains how I felt. And the gist of this guy's message was that there are two types of people in the kingdom, kings and priests. This is obviously coming from the Old Testament and a couple of references in the book of Revelation, which could be interpreted, we are a kingdom of priests, by the way. But anyhow, his whole theology was that I am a priest as your pastor. You are the kings. It is your job to go out and get the money. You bring the money in to me, the priest, and then I speak a blessing over your business, and your business prospers. That's how the economy of the kingdom works. So, I remember at one point he made this statement, and I'm sitting there listening to this nonsense. And he says this, and he spoke with a sort of fake American accent as a South African boykie. And he says, that means your blessing is in my mouth. Your blessing is in my mouth. So, I got home that night, went to the bed and breakfast where they'd put me up, and I was deeply grieved. And I started thinking through the theology that this guy had laid out. And I couldn't help myself. I just started making notes as thoughts came to me. And before I knew it, the message that I was going to preach on the Saturday morning was out the window. And a whole new message had formed. And I proceeded that Saturday morning. Whether this was right or wrong, I don't know. I will let the Lord judge me. At least my motive was right. I then corrected what he had said the next morning. He wasn't in the session on the Saturday morning. He arrived a little bit later, but obviously he was told by one of his henchmen what I had done. And as you can imagine, at the lunch break, things were slightly frosty. And I remember actually sitting there watching him at his table. And it was kind of a buffet. You had to go up and stand in a queue and get your food. And I remember going up to the buffet and purposefully letting people go ahead of me and say, no. And if there were ladies, I let them go ahead. And then I came back to the table, and I remember watching him, and he was sitting back on his seat like this, like a king. And his assistant pastor's wife then arrived at his table and delivered a plate of food to him, which she had stood in the queue to get. And I watched him, and he did not say thank you to her. He just started eating. I have a good mind to name him. I have a good mind to tell you who he is, but my better judgment, I'm not going to do it. Anyhow, I'm getting hot with this message. The memory of this whole thing disturbs me. So, I want to read to you a scripture. Today we read many of the miracles of Elisha. Elisha did double the miracles Elijah did. Isn't that amazing? Scripture is incredible because he'd asked for a double portion of the spirit of Elijah. And so he goes and does twice the number of miracles. And we read a whole bunch of them today. The widow's oil that never ran dry. He purifies a pot of stew that's got poison in it. He feeds 100 men. Of course, Jesus comes and feeds 5,000 and 4,000. Jesus is much greater than this. And then he heals Naaman of his leprosy, the Syrian general. And it's from there that I want to read a verse to you and then make just a few little short comments around how it is that we handle money and the ministry and how we support those in the ministry. So it's 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 26. This comes at the end of the story where Naaman is healed of his leprosy. He dips 7 times in the Jordan as Elisha said he should, and he comes back and he tries to give Elisha money and goods, and Elisha refuses to accept them. But Gehazi, who is Elisha's servant, watches Elisha turn down the offer of all this money and this wealth, and he becomes greedy. And Gehazi now wants some of that for himself. So when Naaman the Syrian general has now turned and gone, he's on his way back to Syria, Gehazi secretly follows him and goes and says to him, 2 of the sons of the prophets have just arrived, and my master, Elisha, has just asked if you could give us a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments, some new clothes. That's what he'd offered. And Naaman says, yeah, I have 2 talents of silver and 2 changes of garments and absolutely anything you want. And he sends him off with it. And Gehazi takes these for himself and he goes now, hides them. And as he arrives back, of course, you can't hide anything from God. And God tells his prophet. And Elisha says this to Gehazi, did not my heart go with you when the man turned back from his chariot to meet you? Now, listen to the question Elisha asks him. Is it time to receive money and to receive clothing, olive groves and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male and female servants? Is it time to receive money for what we have done in the ministry now? And I think that is an incredibly important question, and I think it's a question that we would all do well to continually be asking ourselves. Is it okay to receive money to be in the ministry and for acts of ministry? Well, those are 2 different questions. Is it okay to receive money for being in the ministry? Yes, absolutely. The New Testament says it plainly. It is good for those who preach the gospel to live from the gospel. It is good. Is it okay to receive money for acts of ministry? Well, I think that's a different question. And I think that's going to be part of the wisdom and the answer that we find here from Elisha this morning. Both Jesus and Paul received money for their ministry. They received support. Paul was supported by some churches, like the Philippian church supported him as he was going on missionary journeys to other places. They supported him with financial support. The same thing with Jesus. There were women who had taken it upon themselves to fund Jesus' ministry, and that was okay. We see Elisha himself receiving support from the Shunammite woman. She had prepared a little bedroom for him with a desk and a chair and a lamp, and every time he passed by there, that's where he could stay, and they didn't charge him for accommodation. So he received support. Jesus promised that those who support people in the ministry will receive a reward. He says, if you give so much as a cup of cold water to a prophet in the name of a prophet, in other words, you give it to him because he is doing the Lord's work, you will receive a prophet's reward. So it is good to support those in the ministry. The Bible makes that plain. So when is it appropriate to do this and when is it not? Why was it wrong for Elisha to receive the support of the Shunammite woman but not to receive the gifts from Naaman? Why? Well, perhaps it has something to do with the fact that this with the Syrian general, Naaman, this was evangelism. Naaman arrived as an unbeliever and he left as a believer in the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh. And he said, I will now worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And in fact, he asked for 2 mule loads worth of earth so that he could go back to Syria and have some of the promised land itself where he would worship somehow. And then he asked just for grace. He said, look, I've got to go into the temple of Rimmon with the king because he's old. And when I bow down with him, please just forgive me. And interestingly, Elisha says, don't worry about it. It's fine, man. It's what's in your heart that God cares about. Fascinating answer. That's another message. But I think the primary reason here was that this was an act of ministry performed for Naaman. And so if Elisha had received the gifts from Naaman after this healing ministry to Naaman, that could have created a sense in Naaman's mind that he was paying for the grace and power of God. That you can buy God's mercy. And this is what God does not want. We are not paying for ministry. We are not paying for mercy. We are not paying for grace. We are not paying for miracles. That is not how it works. And so it was now not time to receive money and clothing and olive groves and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male and female servants. And in fact, the act of then receiving that stuff on behalf of Gehazi caused him to be a leper for the rest of his life. God was so displeased with it. We do not purchase the grace of God. The gifts which the apostles and Jesus received for their ministry were acts of faith and selflessness from those who were supporting them. They gave Jesus money not for miracles for them. They gave Jesus money because they believed in what he was doing for others. The Philippians supported Paul not for themselves. They supported him in faith and in generosity so that he could take the gospel to other parts of the world. And there's a purity in that. From both sides, there's a purity from the side of the person receiving the money, and there's a purity from the side of those giving the money, when it is not for an act of ministry exchanged between them. You know, if Zacchaeus had said to Jesus, when Jesus was at his house for dinner, "Look, Lord, I give half my goods to you," Jesus would not have accepted it. But he said, "Look, Lord, I give half my goods to the poor." And so, as I learned those many years ago at that conference, I believe this is a question that we would all do very well to continually be asking ourselves, whether we are in the ministry, receiving money from others, or whether we are supporting those in the ministry. This question of Elisha's should continually be on our lips and in our hearts, because money so easily gets its hook into our hearts. It gets its hook into the hearts of ministers, like that guy who was preaching at that conference, and it gets its hook into people, like the people sitting in that room. They could be deceived, and we become so ready as the sheep of the pasture, receiving this teaching, and we want to believe it because it means I can buy the favor of God. I give you money, you bless me with your mouth, my business becomes more and more wealthy. So greed and avarice can poison both sides, those giving money and those receiving the money. And so this question needs to be on our lips continually, and I'm going to read it to you as we close. Is it time to receive money and receive clothing, olive groves and vineyard, sheep and oxen, male and female servants? See you tomorrow.